You must know something. Jesus is most likely the Messiah.
I have a lot more to learn. It's a lifelong journey.
What if I told you that the actor who portrays Jesus in The Chosen didn't just play the role, but lived it? What if behind the scenes of one of the most spiritually impactful shows ever created, something divine was stirring? Not in a script, not on cue, but in real time, through real people, with real hearts wide open to something sacred? Today, we uncover what happened when Jonathan Roumie surrendered everything to God and how heaven met earth through a television series that millions never expected would change their lives. This is not just a behind-the-scenes story. It's a journey into mystery, into faith, and into the kind of awe that makes the impossible feel undeniably real. Before the first camera ever rolled, before a single miracle was portrayed on screen, Jonathan Roumie was like many actors in Hollywood. Talented, trained, and waiting for a breakthrough. His face had appeared in small productions, and his voice had whispered prayers through years of uncertainty. Yet, nothing seemed to catch. Nothing stuck. The industry's silence can be louder than rejection. For Jonathan, it echoed. Days turned into months. Months turned into prayers. And eventually, prayers turned into surrender. On one of those ordinary mornings, when the future looked too heavy to lift, Jonathan fell to his knees. Jesus, I surrender myself to you. Take care of everything. Not words from a line. Not rehearsed. Just raw, broken faith. That prayer, simple and complete, changed everything. It wasn't the moment success came. It was the moment control left. And when control left, heaven began to move. When Dallas Jenkins was casting for The Chosen, he wasn't looking for a celebrity. He wasn't looking for charm. He was looking for presence, something that went beyond appearance, something that whispered of peace in a room full of noise. When Jonathan walked in, it wasn't his talent that gripped Jenkins. It was his stillness. There was a depth in Jonathan's silence, an unspoken weight that suggested he carried something more than just lines. And that's what Jenkins needed, someone who didn't act like Jesus, but someone who carried him. If you love God and want to grow in faith, grab my book Bible Decoded on Amazon. Link below. Let it change your life. Jonathan had portrayed Jesus before. In church vignettes. In brief scenes, in projects that reached small circles. But this wasn't like that. The Chosen was going to be global. Crowdfunded by believers, skeptics, seekers, and sinners alike. It wasn't just a show, it was a movement. And stepping into the sandals of Christ meant more than just memorizing scripture. It meant breaking apart everything you thought you knew about performance and letting something divine take the lead. From the very first day of filming, something felt different. The Texas heat was relentless, the costumes heavy, the set rugged and raw. But in the stillness between takes, something holy hovered. Extras whispered that they felt chills when none were expected. Crew members confessed to strange flickers of emotion they couldn't explain. And Jonathan, he wasn't just acting. He was walking through something sacred. During the Sermon on the Mount scene, Jonathan stepped forward. The words of Jesus weren't just dialogue. They were alive. As he spoke, something shifted. It was as though the wind paused. As though time gave space for eternity to breathe. His voice echoed not with authority, but with gentleness that pierced hearts. And in that moment, even the cameras weren't sure what they were capturing, an actor portraying a role, or a man standing on the edge of the eternal. Later, Jonathan would say he didn't feel like himself. He wasn't trying to be Jesus. Something else had taken over. Not in a way that removed his humanity, but in a way that elevated it. It was as if God had placed his fingerprints on the script and said, "Let me speak." Not all miracles come with thunder. Some come in silence. A grip paused in the middle of their task, eyes locked on Jonathan. Whispering, "Did you feel that?" A camera operator swore they saw light move in ways no lighting rig was set to do. There was no wind, but during a healing scene, a breeze swept across the set, rustling robes and hair as if brushing through history. Even the equipment seemed to surrender. Sound dropped out unexpectedly. microphones cut at moments so emotionally potent. It was as if heaven wanted the words to belong to the soul, not the speaker. And during playback, soft glows appeared where there had been no lighting setup. Maybe a lens flare, some said. But others knew. They felt it in their bones. This wasn't just filming. It was worship. The transformation wasn't Jonathan's alone. His co-stars felt it too. Liz Tabish, who played Mary Magdalene, found herself in tears during scenes that didn't call for emotion. She wasn't following stage direction. She was responding to something deeper. Something eternal. Paris Patel, portraying Matthew, described scenes where the air thickened. Not with heat, but with something holy. Conversations between takes turned to testimony. Laughter echoed into prayers. People who had walked in as professionals walked out as pilgrims. Many of the actors and crew were not Christians when they began. Some were skeptics. Others indifferent. But something was happening. People began to ask questions. Who is Jesus, really? Why do I feel peace when I watch these scenes? Why do I cry without knowing why? These weren't conversion tactics. There was no altar call. Just presence. Just truth. Portraying Jesus isn't like portraying any other character. There's no room for ego. There's no script that can fully contain divinity. For Jonathan, every day on set was a lesson in humility. He would begin mornings in prayer, asking not to perform, but to be a vessel. And he fasted. Not for the role. For alignment. To strip away anything false and make space for what was real. He studied scripture not to memorize, but to encounter. He carried the burdens of those watching, knowing that his portrayal might be the only Jesus someone sees. And that responsibility was never lost on him. There were days he broke down after filming. Not from exhaustion, but from awe. From a sense that something eternal had passed through him and left him undone. He often said, "I'm just the donkey Jesus rides in on." No spotlight. No glory. Just service. It was during the filming of one of the most sacred moments in Jesus' earthly ministry, the Sermon on the Mount, that the weight of the role began pressing on Jonathan's soul with unrelenting grace. Hundreds of extras gathered under the sweltering sun, their robes clinging to skin, dust rising like incense from beneath their feet. The set had become something more than a film location, it was now a sanctuary without walls. As Jonathan stepped into position, the words of Jesus, words that had stirred generations, dismantled empires, and healed broken hearts, began to form on his lips. But they didn't sound rehearsed. They didn't fall like lines spoken into air. They rang like bells echoing from eternity. He began to speak, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." At that moment, the crowd quieted. Not just the extras, not just the cast, but even the unseen watchers in the hills, birds stilled. Wind stopped, and for a brief second, the world seemed to tilt. Jonathan would later admit that he felt as if time itself had slowed. He was not speaking. He was being spoken through. And when the final words left his mouth, his knees nearly buckled under. The spiritual intensity of it all. He turned, walked away from the mount, and wept. That moment broke something open in him. And not the kind of breaking that wounds, but the kind that liberates. Something inside had shifted. He would never act the same again, not just in the role, but in life. The cast noticed. Crew members noticed. And even viewers who watched the finished episode commented that something unexplainable lingered in Jonathan's eyes. He wasn't just delivering a message, he was embodying one. In the following days, subtle miracles continued. A soft breeze would move through the set at precise moments, never when the cameras were off. Only when the word was alive. A boom mic operator confessed later that he nearly dropped his equipment mid-shot, overcome by a strange but peaceful trembling in his arms. Others began to report similar sensations, warmth on the skin where there was no sun, peace in the chest during the storm scenes, even gentle sobbing from crew members behind the monitors when no one else was speaking. Was it all coincidence? Maybe. But for those on set, it didn't feel like coincidence. It felt like visitation. And yet, not every day was filled with divine light. Jonathan carried his own darkness too. There were moments when doubt crept in like a thief. Anxiety sometimes gripped his chest. His ear would ring without warning, and his heart would race as if running toward something unseen. Doctors had no explanation. Friends said it was stress. But Jonathan began to suspect it was something deeper. A spiritual tension between the flesh and the calling. He would go home after filming and sit in silence, unable to speak. Some nights, he would fall asleep praying. Not for success, but for peace. He didn't want fame. He wanted to be found faithful. In those quiet moments, when the lights were off and the costumes set aside, he met God again, not in the thunder of applause, but in the whisper of surrender. It was then that he rediscovered the prayer he had first spoken when he was broke, alone, and unsure if acting was still his path. Jesus, I surrender myself to you. Take care of everything. That prayer returned, again and again, becoming his anthem. His anchor. One of the most extraordinary days didn't take place in front of the camera. It happened off-set, during a break in filming when cast members began to gather near a quiet stream not far from the set. Word had spread that someone on the team, inspired by what they had seen and felt during filming, wanted to be baptized. Not as a publicity stunt. Not for show. But as a genuine act of faith. Jonathan was invited to witness it. As the crew formed a circle, prayers began to rise like incense. The water shimmered in the Texas heat. And then, one by one, more people stepped forward. By the end of the hour, more than a dozen crew members, extras, and even a set manager had been baptized. Tears flowed freely. Laughter rang out like music. When asked later about the moment, Jonathan simply said, "It wasn't the filming of the water that made it holy. It was the surrender in the water." And we all felt it. The Chosen had never been just a television series. But now, it wasn't even just a ministry. It had become a living prayer. Each scene was offered like incense. Each line, a psalm. And for Jonathan, portraying Jesus became less about acting and more about letting go of ego, of perfectionism, of the need to control how God moved. He began fasting more regularly during shoots, not to impress anyone, but to stay empty enough for the Spirit to fill him. His mornings started in Scripture, and not just the Gospels. He studied Isaiah. He prayed through the Psalms. He even carried handwritten verses tucked inside his robe during certain scenes, not for reference, but for remembrance. Every time I put on the costume, he once said, I don't feel like I'm dressing up. I feel like I'm kneeling down. And that posture began to seep into everything. Cast members felt it. So did Dallas Jenkins, who quietly shared that watching Jonathan portray Jesus didn't just improve the show, it renewed his own faith. What was happening on set couldn't be contained. The cast began holding prayer circles after difficult scenes. Crew members who had been spiritually indifferent started asking questions. A lighting assistant began reading the Gospel of John during lunch breaks. The woman who designed costumes brought in devotionals for the wardrobe team. It spread quietly, like light across dawn. Even Jonathan's co-stars who didn't identify as Christian found themselves stirred. Some began having dreams, vivid, sacred, unsettling dreams that mirrored the parables they had just filmed. One actor shared that he dreamt of walking on water the night before filming that very scene without knowing it was scheduled. And viewers? Viewers felt it too. Letters poured in. Emails flooded the production team. People in hospitals, in prisons, in broken marriages, in depression, all wrote the same thing: I saw Jesus in Jonathan's eyes. Not the actor. The presence. There was one day, no one could explain it, when filming was halted due to technical issues. It was as if something invisible pressed pause on the entire set. Everyone was restless. Time was money. But Jonathan sat quietly on a rock, staring into the distance, unmoving. Dallas Jenkins walked over, placed a hand on his shoulder, and asked if he was okay. Jonathan looked up, tears barely held back, and said, "I feel like I'm not supposed to act today. I feel like I'm supposed to pray." Jenkins, moved but unsure, gave the crew a short break. Jonathan remained where he was, eyes closed, hands clasped, whispering to heaven. 10 minutes later, the cameras restarted. No glitches. No delays. The footage from that scene later became one of the most emotionally gripping in the entire series. Viewers who saw it reported goosebumps, unexpected tears, and moments of clarity. Something sacred had passed through the screen. If you love God and want to grow in faith, grab my book Bible Decoded on Amazon. Link below. Let it change your life. If this content blesses you and you'd like to support our mission, you can buy me a coffee or give a super thanks. Every contribution helps us create more content to inspire and uplift others. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on my future videos.